They say the Mongol horde was unstoppable, that their horses drank from rivers of blood, and their arrows blotted out the sun itself. By 1240, they'd done something no empire before them had managed. They'd made conquest boring. Not because it was easy, but because it was inevitable. The formula was simple, really. Ride into a kingdom, surround their prettiest city, wait for the screaming to start, then move on to the next one, while the survivors tried to remember what their children looked like. China fell like a house of cards soaked in kerosene. Persia burned so thoroughly that the smell of charred flesh became the new normal. Russia surrendered so fast, you'd think they were being polite. And yet, in the frozen hellscape of northeastern Europe, something went wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, not in the way that makes for good dramatic paintings of last stands and heroic sacrifices. No, this was worse. This was the kind of wrong that makes generals wake up at night in cold sweats doing math. Because the Mongols, those masters of mechanical violence, those artists of systematic destruction, encountered men who simply refused to be conquered efficiently. And in the brutal economics of empire building, efficiency is everything. Let me paint you a picture of what the Mongols were by 1240. These were teenagers on horses playing at war. These were professionals who spent their entire adult lives perfecting the art of making other people as empires disappear. They'd sat through the siege of Kiev, watching civilians eat their own leather boots before resorting to darker meals. They witnessed the Khwarezmian Empire go from regional superpower to historical footnote in less time than it takes most kingdoms to plan a decent coronation. They learned how to make fortified cities open their gates by building pyramids of skulls outside the walls. Pyramids so high that birds nested in them, and so numerous that you could navigate by them like grotesque lighthouses. They understood siege warfare the way surgeons understand anatomy, clinically, precisely, and with a disturbing lack of emotional investment. They knew how to starve cities, how to poison water supplies, how to spread disease like farmers spreading seeds. They'd refined terror into a science with peer-reviewed results. The Vikings they were about to meet weren't the Hollywood version. Forget the horned helmets and the noble savage nonsense. By 1240, the age of showing up at monasteries and asking politely if they could have all the gold had largely passed. These were farmers who happened to be exceptionally good at violence, traders who understood that the best business deals were made at Hex Point, sailors who could navigate through fog so thick you could choke on it. They lived in communities where your grandfather's grandfather's combat technique was passed down like a family recipe, except the recipe was for dismembering armed opponents in close quarters. They inhabited a landscape that killed outsiders through simple exposure, where winter wasn't a season, but a 6-month-long murder attempt by the weather itself. They built their entire culture around surviving conditions that would make other civilizations pack up and move to somewhere civilized, like the Sahara Desert. When the Mongol reconnaissance units first swept through Scandinavian territories, they followed their standard playbook. Count the fighting-age males, assess the fortifications, identify the political structures, map the escape routes, estimate how many arrows it would take to make resistance seem unreasonable. This intelligence gathering had worked from the Pacific to Poland. It had never produced results that didn't make sense. Until now, the data coming back from the scouts created patterns that made commanders squint at maps and wonder if their scouts had been drinking fermented Mare's milk again. The settlements were scattered like someone had thrown darts at a map while blindfolded. Political authority was so fragmented that finding someone in charge was like trying to find a specific snowflake in a blizzard. Military forces didn't gather in armies. They just sort of existed everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. There was no king's throat to cut, no capital to surround, no treasury to loot that would make the whole campaign worth the horse feed. The Mongol strategy of decapitation strikes, that beautiful tactic of killing leadership and watching the body politic collapse, had no target. You can't decapitate what has no head. You can't negotiate with a distributed network of autonomous warriors who viewed central authority the way modern people view medieval dentistry, with suspicion and a strong preference for doing things themselves. The Mongol commanders adapted because that's what professionals do. If the standard conquest methodology wouldn't work, they'd default to the universal language of violence. They'd burn settlements until submission looked better than immolation. They'd decreate examples so horrific that stories about them would travel faster than armies and do half the work before the soldiers even arrived. This had worked in Persia. It had worked in China. It had worked in Russia. It would work here, or so they thought, right up until the moment it spectacularly didn't. The first Mongol force that entered a coastal Viking settlement expected what they always expected: terror, flight, or both. Instead, they got something that didn't fit their operational manual. The Vikings fortified, which was reasonable. But they fortified in ways that suggested they'd been taking notes on every mistake the Mongols' previous victims had made, and specifically designed their defense to exploit Mongol weaknesses. The settlement backed against cliffs that turned Mongol cavalry, those unstoppable instruments of mobile death, into expensive lawn ornaments. The approaches funneled through passages so narrow that Mongol numerical superiority became mathematically irrelevant. The buildings were constructed from materials that looked at Mongol fire arrows and laughed in Norse. The architecture itself was a weapon, designed by people who understood that the best defense wasn't a wall, but terrain that made attacking more painful than retreating. The battle started at dawn, with Mongol archers launching volleys designed to create panic and suppress movement. These were men who could hit a rabbit at 200 paces while riding at full gallop. Their arrows had ended dynasties. The Vikings responded with coordinated defensive fire from protected positions, not trying to win an archery contest, but forcing the Mongols into closer combat where different rules applied and where axes had opinions about composite bows. Mongol cavalry attempted coastal flanking maneuvers and encountered Viking ships positioned as mobile weapons platforms. These weren't merchant vessels. They were floating nightmares crewed by men who understood water-based combat in ways that steppe warriors couldn't imagine. Horses that were assets on plains became liabilities on rocky shorelines where they could ungenerate the momentum that made. Mongol charges turned enemy formations into red mist. The fighting condensed into close-quarters brutality, and this was not the Mongols' preferred venue. They excelled at mobility, at raining death from horseback, at psychological warfare that made enemies surrender before steel met flesh. The Vikings countered with a fighting style built for individual combat, so vicious it had its own oral tradition. They wielded axes designed to break shields and the arms holding them. They used environmental knowledge to create kill zones where Mongol numbers became disadvantages, where being numerous just meant more corpses. They fought with the desperation of men defending not some abstract imperial concept, but their families, their homes, their specific pieces of frozen earth that they'd spent generations making habitable. By nightfall, the Mongols withdrew, which was unusual but explainable. They'd regroup, reassess, return with adjusted tactics. Except they didn't, because the coastal settlement had produced a body count that made the cost-benefit analysis uncomfortable. The Mongol Empire expanded where expansion made economic sense. They weren't mindless conquerors. They were businessmen whose business happened to be conquest. Every campaign was evaluated on resource efficiency. They conquered territories that could be administered profitably, that generated tribute to fund further expansion. Scandinavia was presenting an equation that didn't balance. The scattered settlements meant extended campaigns. The terrain favored defenders. The climate created supply challenges that made quartermasters wake up screaming. The population was distributed in ways that made total conquest require resource investments that exceeded probable returns. And the Vikings were demonstrating a willingness to die that exceeded their strategic value as subjects. A second Mongol force attempted siege tactics, surrounding a settlement and waiting for supplies to diminish. This had worked against fortified cities across Asia, where urban populations panicked when the food ran out. It failed against Vikings, who rebuilt their entire culture around surviving harsh conditions with whatever they could scavenge, preserve, or steal. Settlements that endured 6-month winters where going outside could kill, you weren't going to surrender because of food shortages. The Mongols escalated, destroying outlying farms, killing livestock, burning fields, attempting to create conditions where surrender became survival's only option. The Vikings responded by intensifying resistance, sending small raiding parties from forests to attack Mongol supply lines. They used tactics the Mongols normally employed against enemies: mobility, unpredictability, striking from nowhere, and vanishing into terrain that swallowed outsiders whole. By the time a third confrontation occurred on open ground, where Mongol doctrine should have prevailed, the pattern was undeniable. The Vikings had prepared the battlefield with hidden pits, concealed archers, terrain modifications that turned apparent advantages into death traps. The fighting lasted hours with neither side gaining decisive advantage, and when the Mongols withdrew this time, it wasn't tactical repositioning. It was strategic reassessment. The commanders who deconquered from China to Hungary were facing an opponent that didn't fit their operational models. The Vikings weren't superior militarily. They were incompatible systematically. The Mongol system was designed to conquer empires, not to subjugate distributed warrior cultures with no centralized authority to break and no concentrated wealth worth the body count. The withdrawal from Scandinavia in 1240 wasn't a military defeat in the traditional sense. The Mongols weren't forced to retreat by superior enemy forces. They simply did the math and chose a different direction. But the result was identical to defeat. The unstoppable force stopped. The Vikings didn't celebrate because from their perspective, they just continued being Vikings, defending settlements and maintaining autonomy like they always had. They didn't realize they'd accomplished something historically significant, that they'd made conquest too expensive for the most efficient killing machine in human history. The Mongol Empire that had destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire and subjugated Kiev and Rus had encountered structural incompatibility. Against warriors who were distributed, autonomous, willing to fight indefinitely for land with no strategic value, the Mongol system had no effective response. Sometimes the strongest force doesn't win. Sometimes it just calculates the cost and moves on, leaving behind a battle history tried to forget, because it asked a question empires hate answering. What happens when unstoppable force meets a movable object, and the unstoppable force has accountants?